Hi everyone, welcome back to another edition of Dad's Planning Politics.
Hi everyone, welcome back. We're getting up there with our episodes now. What is this, the
The
20
30th, I think.
30th episode? Look at
Mm.
us, guys. You're part of an exclusive club. Listening to our 30th episode. It's really exciting. If you've been here from the beginning, thank you so much for sticking with us. If you're new to the podcast, thank you so much for joining. But today we're gonna continue on what we talked about last week. We're gonna talk about obviously Iran and what's happening there and the massive war that seems to be breaking out in the Middle East, which is, I think terrifying everyone in the world because it's going to have far-reaching implications. We're also going to talk about the G7. And that's really it for today. We're going to just focus
Two
on
big
those
meaty topics.
two big topics, but we'll try and dive into them.
So, should we start with the G7?
Yeah, let's start with the G7.
Okay, so Mark Carney hosting in Canada, in Alberta. Seemed like a lovely scene with mountains in the background, etc. And of course, this was one of the first multinational meetings where Donald Trump attended with the heads of France and Germany and the UK and
Italy, Japan as well.
Yep.
Yeah. So that is the G7. Just so you know, let's list them all out just in case you haven't heard of it. So obviously it's Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK. And prior to Russia's expulsion, Russia as well. But then obviously Russia's aggressive imperialist moves around Ukraine and particularly Crimea, made the rest of the G7 expel them from the G7, and now it's a factor of being part of the group is that you can't invade other countries' land. That's one of their key requirements, one of their only requirements, and they're meant to be the leaders of economic growth in the free world. That's what they call themselves. Yeah.
And they also invite some other countries, like they invited Anthony Albanese from Australia, and they invited Narendra Modi from India, and one or two other national leaders not part of the G7, but significant middle-sized countries or large countries in the case of India. So, of course, Donald Trump, as he's like to do, raised heckles there because he said, "I'm not sure why Russia is no longer a part of this." He kind of knew the reason why, as Freddie just explained, the invasion of Crimea.
I mean, I think he said it even upon entering. He said to Carney, "I don't know why Russia's not here. I don't know why Vladimir isn't here. I don't understand." Which obviously is, telling everyone his goals and his key relationships from the get-go. He's saying, "I am aligned with Russia. I'm not aligned with any of you."
And an amusing part of it that I saw was Trump was going on and talking about, blue states and red states and all that stuff. And Carney politely cut him off and said, "If you don't mind, as chairman of the G7, I'm going to call the right to move on to the next topic." So he did it in a very diplomatic but somewhat forceful way. So I'm not sure whether Trump was a little miffed by that, but that was an interesting interlude. The other interesting thing I saw was Trump was sort of off keel a little bit. He, the whole free trade agreement with the UK, he was with Keir Starmer and he dropped all the papers on the floor, right? The agreement on the ground. And it was interesting because Keir Starmer bent down to pick them up for him. So there's been lots of discussion in the UK of whether that was appropriate thing for the British Prime Minister to do that. And the opinion is probably not, and they should have waited for an aide to rush in and pick them up.
I mean, I think it's interesting the two things that you just mentioned. So one of the things that you mentioned was Carney, butting in and telling Trump we have to move on to the next agenda, the next item on the agenda. And the other thing is Keir Starmer kneeling down to pick up Trump's papers for him, which seems like an act of deference. So you see the different approaches by these two different world leaders and how Carney, as soon as he was elected and came into office, has seemed a much stronger more oppositional
Hmm.
force to Trump than Keir Starmer has, and I wonder if that's just because of the Canadian opposition to Trump and the incredibly low approval ratings of Trump
Yeah,
that
it
are
could
in
be.
Canada, or if that's simply because Canada is now looking to strengthen their relationships with other people, and the UK is still hoping to have a good relationship with the US.
No, you're right, but I was putting myself in that position. It's an interesting human reaction because Keir Starmer's several decades younger than Trump, right? So if you put
Decades.
yourself in that position, do you bend down to pick up the papers, right? I mean, your natural human instinct would be to do that, to assist someone older than yourself. But then your political brain has to jump in and say, well, it's better that an aide comes and does that because it doesn't look very good.
I mean, definitely, I think regardless of what it meant in the moment, what it meant to the world and to the media is that Keir Starmer doesn't have a backbone when it comes to Trump, and he is willing to, make compromises and kneel over and bow down to him in order to get better circumstances for the UK, better trade deals, better, military deals, even to continue the AUKUS agreement, like a whole number of things. Because I'm fairly sure those files, in fact, were about
The free
the
trade agreement.
the free trade agreement itself. So, that also says something that Keir Starmer cares so much more about it than Trump does.
So Trump stayed the first day and he stayed for the dinner, and then he gave his excuses and said he had to return to Washington given what's happening in the Middle East.
But he actually, I will interrupt you there because of course that is what a lot of the media is saying. But I think there was a few articles about the fact that he didn't do that. He didn't give any excuses whatsoever. The other leaders assumed that was surely what he was doing because why else would he neglect the G7, which is such an important summit? But he didn't give any reason. He just left.
But did his people give a reason?
I don't think so. As far as I know, they didn't. Emmanuel Macron tweeted he must have left
Oh, I see.
because of Iran and the developments happening there. And Trump tweeted back saying Emmanuel Macron doesn't know what he's talking about. He never knows what he's talking about. He's wrong. That it was not because of Iran. There will be no peace, no peace in Iran.
Agreement.
I
No
think
peace
peace
agreement.
agreement. Yeah, he tweeted a lot of quite drastic stuff, which is interesting because obviously Trump doesn't like war. He's not for war. No war. So
But it's fascinating because I think Trump doesn't like multilateral meetings. He likes
no.
unilateral meetings where he's the center of attention. I don't think he likes it when he's with these other world leaders who take some of the spotlight from him. I
Mm.
think it's
And
just
treat him
his.
as an equal.
Yeah, exactly. He can't handle that. And because the fact is, he could have dealt with anything in Canada versus returning to Washington to do that. Canada does have broadband and
Mm.
communications and secure rooms and stuff. It is rather
I mean, he was
amusing.
probably going to find a way to leave it early, regardless of what was happening in the rest of the world. Iran
Hmm.
was just a convenient excuse.
Good that he went in a way. It's good that at least he went.
At least he did go. At least he wants to keep up. I think that's because he likes playing the part of a president, though.
Mm,
And I think he likes the drama and the glamour of going to an international meeting and having to go to Canada
yes.
and having to fly there and
Yeah.
getting seen by people and going to meetings, etc. And he wants a photo ops. He wants to have a photo op with Keir Starmer kneeling on the ground in front of him, and then he wants to go back to his gaudy White House, all decked out in gold and glam, and not do any of the work. He just likes the look and the aesthetic of it all.
And so he signed a communique, talking about trying to get a peace agreement. It seems like a sort of mediocre sort of communique to me
Mm.
because, it's really interesting as we now. Did you have anything else to say on the G7 at this point? Oh, from an Australian perspective, Anthony Albanese had wanted to have a meeting with Trump, but of course Trump left, and so Albo was left in his wake. And, it's funny, the Australian media say, he didn't have the meeting and he should have tried harder. It's the most ridiculous discussion I've ever heard, right?
Yeah.
Because the fact is, he planned a meeting with him, and Trump decides to leave early. That's what happens, right? And so,
And the fact is that we mean nothing to Trump, and no other country means anything to Trump. And it's nothing that Albert did wrong, it's just that Trump has other things on his mind. But yeah, our media tries to turn it into a whole political backlash against our Prime Minister when it's simply not that. It's simply just Trump,
the chaos of the
being
Trump world.
spontaneous.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So let's move on to Israel's attacks on Iran and Iran's attacks on Israel as a result of this. So, just a bit of background for those of you who haven't kept up with this. There was fears that Iran was close to having a nuclear bomb, and Israel has always said they're not
We
going
did
to
go
allow
into
that
this
to
a bit
happen.
in
We
the
did
last
say that
episode.
last time. Yep. So Israel has attacked Iran and some of the nuclear sites and some of the places in Tehran, and they've killed quite a few military leaders and heads of the Secret Service in Iran. And it seems like they have air superiority over Iran at the moment. So
I'm not entirely sure of all that as well, though. I think that's a narrative that's being pushed by the Trump administration. So I think we should be careful of what we say.
But they seem to have a very effective air force, the Israelis. They seem to be able to do this stuff in a very effective way. And yes, there's been some missiles from Iran that have landed in Israel and killed people and caused damage and stuff, but not a huge impact compared to the Israeli impact in Iran.
Look, I think we really have to wait and see. I think this is a bomb waiting to go off, quite literally. I think that, yes, Israel's had a long time to plan their attack and their offensive on Iran. They've been planning this for a long time. This has been their one foreign policy really objective for the past 20 years or more, right? Iran is the threat that they hope to get rid of. And I mean, Iran is the threat that the world would ideally like to not exist, but it's not as simple as just attacking them with a few missiles and the problem goes away.
That's true. And the interesting thing is perhaps they want as well regime change, because the fact is the regime in Iran, from all accounts, is very unpopular with the population of Iran. And so that could be part of it, that they would like regime change as well. And it'll be interesting whether that happens. And of course, Trump is now going onto Truth Socials, telling all the residents of Tehran to leave the city immediately. So the power of this is pretty incredible. Then you see lines of people leaving Tehran. It's a huge city, so it's not like people can evacuate overnight. And they said they knew where the Ayatollah was, the supreme leader of Iran.
The Ayatollah.
Yeah, so
Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
So interesting. They're ratcheting up the pressure on Iran, and the whole talk is, will the US get involved? Because one of the bunkers in Iran is way underground, the nuclear bunkers, and the only piece of military equipment that can get so far underground,
the bunkers where they store the missiles components,
is a US incredible size bomb that the B-1 bomber would deliver. But the other thing that's super scary about this that I read about is there is a danger if they do that. There'll be a radioactive leak, and that will go into the Gulf, the water of the Gulf, and everyone in the Middle East uses that water for desalination, etc. So there is huge risk.
I mean, look, I talked about this a bit last week as well. I talked about the fact that you would need a massive American-made bomb in order to destroy these missile storage centers and sites. And look, the US is now getting involved, and Trump is now openly saying that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, I actually don't know how to say his name, is an easy target, which is a terrifying statement for him to be making, and he obviously has no idea what he's doing. Because when you think of Iran, you need to think about them in the context of the fact that they have supported most of the terrorism across the world for the past 20 years at least, right? Obviously, they've been supplying Hezbollah for a long time. They've been supplying Hamas in Palestine. They've been supplying Russia even with all the drones and a lot of the military that they've been using in Ukraine. They've been supplying a whole host of people for an incredibly long period of time. And so you have to think about the storage of weapons they have themselves and the missiles they have at hand. And I don't think it would be that surprising if they do have nuclear missiles or they're incredibly close to having them. So I think Trump saying something like their supreme leader is an easy target is incredibly dangerous, especially since about a week ago or so, Pete Hegseth, I'm pretty sure it was, he was saying the US has no part of this. The US has nothing to do with the Israeli strikes. We want to take ourselves out of the situation. And now Trump has completely flipped the script again, just to say that the Supreme Leader is an easy target. So look, we're going to see what happens. I think Trump has decided that he's undefeatable and cannot be harmed. We'll see what happens with that.
But we'll see if something happens at all. Often there's a lot of bluster in the Trump playbook here.
There's bluster in the Trump playbook, but the Iranians and the Israelis are not messing around.
Well, they're not messing around.
That's the problem here. It's like a toddler playing with a live gun.
Yeah,
or a firecracker. The toddler doesn't know what it's doing, but the weapon sure does. So we'll just have to see what happens with that. I don't know if you have something more to add.
Yeah, it's politically fascinating and super scary for the world. Particularly, I think Trump doesn't have a very experienced national security team. These people aren't sort of tried and tested over a lot of years. Fox News anchor as the defense secretary, etc. I mean, this is just scary stuff, right? Because you could make the wrong move and, for example, cause radioactive devastation across the Middle East, right? Which would be incredibly
across
damaging.
The world.
Yeah, across the world, but this leakage of radioactive material.
But I think it's also naive to think that one nuclear leak and one nuclear kind of incident would be restricted to just one nuclear incident. I think if we're getting to the point where America is sending incredibly massive bombs to destroy nuclear infrastructure and it's harming the Iranian people to such an extent that, radiation poisoning across the country, I don't think Iran would necessarily hold back on their own missiles. And we'd have to see what happens then. And then that's major escalation. That's end of the world type escalation. And I mean, I was telling my dad this earlier, there's been a lot of stuff on the internet recently of how to survive a nuclear apocalypse, etc., because it's starting to feel that we're getting close to that than we ever have before. What's it called?
Well, those of you who are young and never got to it before, we had that many years ago, right?
Yeah,
when I was young, right?
The same. And I think that you and your
Cuban
generation...
Missile Crisis was very much...
No, they were never going to actually do anything. That's why... No, I've gone... What do you mean, That's not an argument. You're just saying, That's not a valid argument. They weren't going to do anything. They made a mistake. They thought that the US wouldn't notice that they'd repositioned their missiles. As soon as the US noticed, they took them away. If they were actually confident about doing something with them, they would have left them there and done something, right? But as soon as the US said anything, they just wanted to use them as leverage. This is a different thing. That was leverage. That was power plays. This is revenge, anger, and real, the issue of national sovereignty and two big powers actively hurting each other and targeting each other. And look, it's the fate of the entire world at stake. And I think that even though your generation seems to think everything will be okay and that the good guy will always win in the end, we've been raised with these storybooks where the good guy always wins. I don't think that's necessarily a certainty. I know that's a bit depressing, but those are my thoughts.
Well, look, hopefully this nightmare scenario doesn't come to pass. And ideally, the nuclear capability of Iran is done away with. But it's interesting to think that any country who gets close to having nuclear capability, does the world have the right to bomb it? right?
Vomit
Bomb that country,
or
for
vomit.
example, because think about when Israel got the nuclear bomb. Would that have given, Iran the right to bomb Israel to stop them having the bomb?
Well, that's the question.
Why is it okay for some countries and not for others?
I mean, obviously, you could say an argument of racism, but you also have to acknowledge the fact that Iran is a lot less predictable and a lot more violent and aggressive than a lot of other countries that we
Hmm.
have on the international front at the moment. So it's really a case by case basis. I really think you have to see, but it shows how dangerous nuclear weapons are, and you know, like armies in general, powerful armies, because administration may be stable and democratic one moment and the next turn into an autocratic regime, like we're seeing across the world. So you can't rely on any country to be stable and to make good choices. And you have to keep in the moment, you know?
And then in the meantime, it's getting difficult to plan for the pilots to plan flight paths across the world, right? There's so many areas to avoid. It's becoming a little crazy, right?
Yeah.
If you think about Russia and the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, great chatting with you, Freddie.
Pleasure.
Hope you've enjoyed this episode. Like us and tell your friends, and have a great week. Bye.